Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the CEO of Stand Together, Brian Hooks, and the CEO of Atlas Network, Brad Lipps.
Thanks so much, everyone. This is one of the parts of the program I've been really looking forward to, getting a chance to sit down with Brian Hooks. He's the CEO of Stand Together Foundation, a community of 700 plus business leaders and philanthropists that work to empower people to realize their unique potential, working at all levels of education, working with activists for policy change, and more than 200 community organizations addressing poverty. Brian's also the president of Charles Koch Foundation, Charles Koch Institute, and he's the co-author with Charles Koch of a wonderful book called Believe in People, Bottom-Up Solutions for a Top-Down World. Brian, I thought we'd start the conversation by asking you to tell us a little bit about the personal journey that led to your appreciation of the ideas presented in the book.
Sure. Well, hey, thanks, Brad, and thanks for having me at this event. It's really exciting to be back, not just in person, but in person with a bunch of old friends, and it's just a phenomenal group. I was at dinner last night. It was great to see the energy that you guys have generated for the ideas of a free society, and what could be more important right now than the work that we're all doing and that the group that you've put together is doing, given what's happening in our country. So I didn't realize when I heard about the event that it was the 40th anniversary of Atlas. That's extraordinary. So congratulations. And so as I was thinking about that, I was reflecting on the situation in the country right now, but also on my experience with Atlas. And as I was thinking about it, it turns out Atlas has been really important in my life and in my career and in how I now think about the work that we have to do to really make the full-throated case for freedom and ideas that we know help people to improve their lives. So indulge me, if you will. I want to share a couple of things that hit me as I was thinking about this week. And as I was thinking about Atlas, there was one quote from Hayek that just kept ringing in my ear. And for those of you who know me, you know that I spent 14 years at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, so it will come as a surprise to no one that when I think about these ideas, I think about Hayek. And the quote is one that's familiar to this group. It's what he said in the Intellectuals and Socialism when he was challenging his generation, that the task ahead of us was to once again make the building of a free society an intellectual adventure, right? And he said a deed of courage. I think that language is so important right now, an intellectual adventure and a deed of courage. And after all, I think that's what Atlas has been doing for 40 years, right? And more than any other group really sort of brings those ideas to life. And so I was thinking about two formative experiences that I've had with Atlas way back when both of us were much younger. And they really made a huge impression on me, and I think that they're resonant now, given the situation of the country. And as I think about it, really kind of match what we were trying to accomplish with this book in terms of a call to action. What's necessary right now to make the greatest difference for people in the country to help empower them based on these ideas? And the first experience was one back in 2003. It was, I think, the first European Resource Bank, which is what I think you called the Liberty Forum back then. And it never happened before. And so none of us who got on the plane in Dulles to fly to Bulgaria quite knew what we were in for, but we were excited about it. And it was 2003, I was just a couple of years into my job at Mercatus, and we got off the plane in Sofia, and I'll never forget that drive from the airport to this old Soviet resort, right? I forget the name of the town. It wasn't a long drive, maybe 30 minutes or so. Some of you might have been part of this event. It was my first time to Eastern Europe. And what struck me was looking out the window, there was this old, beautiful city that was crumbling, and it was dirty, and the people there were poor, and there was obvious struggling and suffering. And so for me, it was the first time, I'd been traveled around many countries and that sort of thing, but it was the first time that I really confronted the consequences of this top-down approach that treats people as problems to be solved, sort of cedes direction and control to a select few and then forces people to comply. And the ideas that I had cared about and was working on, you could see the consequence of not realizing freedom viscerally. And so that made a huge impression on me. Second thing, and that made a greater impression on me, were the people that I met from the Atlas Network in Bulgaria. And I will never forget meeting the people that were hosting, the folks at, I think it was the Institute for Market Economics, a woman named Svetla and a guy named Krasen, who were wonderful hosts. And these people were on fire. I mean, they were so energized by the ideas. And as I was reflecting on this on my way back, and once I got back to Mercatus, it hit me that two things were really important about that experience. One was Toefl, Crossan, and so many of the other folks that I met there, they had experienced the devastation that comes with this top-down paradigm firsthand. So they knew what was at stake in the fight for a free society. So they knew what was at stake, and then they said, look, it's not going to change unless somebody does something about it, and that somebody's going to have to be me. And so they saw a role for themselves in making progress. So I got back to the US and I thought, wow, this is a movement that matters, and it matters a lot in helping people to live better lives. And if those people that I just met, who have so little in terms of the resources and the developed infrastructure for these ideas, felt like they could make a difference, certainly we could do something here in this country. And that lesson has really stuck with me and sort of, is something that I've tried to take with me for the last 20 years. And then quickly, another experience happened, again, thanks to Atlas, very quickly after that. A couple of years later, I think, we had started a project at Mercatus on studying barriers to entrepreneurship in Africa. And we didn't go anywhere internationally without first calling Atlas, so we called up Atlas, and you guys introduced us to the folks at the Free Market Foundation. And here again, I get off the plane in Johannesburg, spend a week in South Africa, and you can't help but just be confronted with the consequences of the failed top-down ideas that have characterized so much of human history. And in this case, of course, it's apartheid, which had ended a decade prior, but the consequences were still very much front and center. And again, you see the consequences, but you also see the inspiration of the people. In this case, Eustace Davies and Themba Nolachungu. If you guys have ever met these folks at the Free Market Foundation, they were some of the most inspirational freedom fighters I'd ever met. And I got back, and again, they knew it was at stake. They could see it, and they felt like they needed to do something in order to make a difference. And so, two pretty different experiences. One, you see this top-down approach coming from the radical left, former Soviet Union. The other, you see this top-down approach of control coming from the nationalist right in South Africa. Seemingly very different, but really sort of based on the same notion that the way that they saw progress in society was in taking control over people, taking power over people, rather than, what we know works is empowering people from the bottom up to realize the promise of the ideas of a free society. And I don't want to pretend like there's some sort of moral equivalency between those horrific regimes and what's happening today, but I do think that there's a lesson for us in the freedom movement when it comes to thinking what our role is now in really sort of recognizing and helping to show people what's at stake when it comes to the ideas of a free society. Because we're starting to see those consequences in this country right now with so much of this top-down approach characterizing our lives. And then also really being inspired to say, we have to stand up. We are the ones that are going to make a difference. And so when I was here last night and I saw sort of the talent that's coming up through the movement and the resources that the network here is providing them, I mean, it's really encouraging that now is the opportunity to do this, to go out, as Atlas has done, find those Thembas and those Svetlas, those social entrepreneurs, in the language that we use in the book, who have a vision for how to act on these principles to help make it a better country.
No, thanks for that, Brian. And one of the things that has excited me, and I think in Lenore's Lidio lecture this morning, she sort of alluded to this this new energy that we're seeing, not just from the fact that we have great, talented people here, but I think there's more of an intellectual curiosity about how we look at the ideas a little bit differently. And what was really exciting over the last couple of years is to realize that the path that you and your colleagues that Stand Together have been on, and the path that we've been on at Atlas, led a great deal by Matt Warner, first looking at lessons in the developing world and how conversations about solving poverty have been evolved. We're coming to some really interesting new insights. And one of those, I think, is to appreciate building on what is working as opposed to looking at deficits in communities. And I'll give you, the epiphany that I had was that if you'd asked me some years ago what to do to address poverty, I would go back to that famous, a rising tide lifts all boats, a comment that Ronald Reagan would use, and I know JFK had cited earlier. And and that's certainly part of the solution. Better tax policy does create more broad economic opportunity, but if that's our only answer, I think it misses a big part of the equation. It still treats people in low-income communities as though they don't have agency, as though they're as dependent on some outside force as I think the leftists make this mistake, thinking they need to wait for some top-down program to redistribute wealth to them. Let's look at the problems that they have and how they're trying to solve it. And that's one of the exciting things I saw in the book. And maybe you could talk about Mauricio Miller and the influence that he's brought to the work of Stand Together and what it looks like in practice.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. The way I think about it is the work that we all do in public policy to push back on government overreach and to really realize policy that's aligned with our principles, the principles of a free society, is essential. Societies cannot work without that work. But if that's all we do, we're going to miss the opportunity to really realize the benefits of that hard work and the creative side of liberalism, of classical liberalism. And so that really has been, I think, a huge step forward for all of us as we think about what needs to happen to really bring about the good society. Again, I'll go back to Hayek, right? He talked about he was an economist by training, but he was a philosopher at heart. And he talked about the economist who's only economist is probably dangerous, right? What we care about is how people live well together. And it absolutely requires, free market economy principles. It requires the principles of limited government, but it also requires social norms of mutual benefit. It also requires the kind of, the sort of standards of respect of the institutions in our society that will empower people to realize the benefits of freedom. And when you live in a society that has for decades been stymied, right? I mean, I think Robert Enlow did a great job this morning talking about this in education. If we just get policy right in education, then we expect sort of voila, the market will solve. We miss the damage that's been done by this top-down approach that has caused what should be those market connections to atrophy. And so we need to help breathe some life into that and really show people the benefits of freedom. And you mentioned Mauricio Miller. Mauricio is the founder of an organization called the Family Independence Initiative. They call themselves Upworthy now. And we talk about them in the book as a great example of how a free society works to empower people, even those who are struggling. And it's a direct contrast in terms of acting on these principles as a way to empower people to lift themselves and their communities out of poverty. It's a great contrast to the failed war on poverty. And we all know the story, decades and almost $20 trillion, and the poverty rate hasn't budged. Mauricio starts this small little organization out of Oakland, California, and for on average about $3,500 that he makes available to them over 2 years, families who stick with the program for 2 years, their annual income increases almost 30%. And unlike a lot of these other programs where you might see that, but then you see it go back down, these families stay on a trajectory to lift themselves out of poverty. He does that by practicing our principles, the principles of liberalism, the principles that Adam Smith wrote about before he wrote The Wealth of Nations, about what it means to live well together. Mutual benefit, respect, social capital that helps people to realize their best selves by helping others to do the same. And that's ultimately what our movement is going to bring, I think, to the problems in the country. And I'm really excited to see so many organizations really kind of taking that holistic view and moving it forward to realize the promise of these principles.
The book spends a good amount of time talking about some celebrated social entrepreneurs, from Rich Toefl and the creation of the Log Cabin Republicans, and looking all the way back to Frederick Douglass. I'm curious about how at Stand Together you're thinking about the development of new social entrepreneurs, and whether you're looking for people who are already doing good things, or if you're trying to train up and energize people to be inspired by disruptors in the social sector.
Yeah, so one of the most fun parts about writing this book was we got to ask people that I really admire and that I've learned so much from to lend their voice to it. So Rich Toefl is an example. He's in the book. He tells his story of fighting the good fight, against in a very difficult situation in terms of what turned out to be the marriage equality movement, but really was gay rights early on. And wow, I mean, if you Google Rich Toefl and some of the battles that he went through, I mean, that guy's a hero. We also talk about great American heroes like Frederick Douglass, and I think about Douglass as sort of the quintessential social entrepreneur, right? And there's so much that we can learn from a guy like Frederick Douglass for the work that we do. I take two sort of really important lessons from his life, which is like off the charts, but we see this in all of our social entrepreneurs that we support. One is Douglass goes through this personal transformation to really identify what he's great at, develop his skills as an advocate and an orator under the absolute worst conditions that anybody could ever imagine, right? A guy born into slavery. And through that self-development, he becomes one of the greatest American heroes in our history. You know, applying his gift of advocacy and oration to not just abolish the most monstrous of institutions, slavery, but ultimately to advocate for equal rights for women, for a more open society for immigrants, and so on. And so the personal transformation that somebody has to go through to really be able to contribute at their fullest, I think we see that in a guy like Frederick Douglass. But then you look at the impact he had on society, and it wasn't random, right? And this, I think, is a really important point. A lot of people talk about social entrepreneurship, but entrepreneurship is about creating value, and value is defined by a standard. And the standard that guides Douglass, and I think all of the social entrepreneurs that truly create value in our society, are the principles of a free society. And for Douglass, those are articulated in the Declaration of Independence. And so most people are familiar with his speech on the 4th of July, where he is admonishing our country to live up to these principles, right? And he says these are saving principles, right? Stand by these principles, be true to them against all foes, on all occasions, at whatever cost. And so his North Star are the principles of a free society, and then he's an entrepreneur to find new and better ways to pull our country towards those principles. And that's what we're doing, right? That's what you guys are doing, and that's what we're here to sort of get done. And we got to be open to finding those social entrepreneurs amongst people like you and me, who have grown up in sort of our think tank community, as well as people like Rich Toefl or people that we talk about in the book who are finding ways to help empower people to overcome the problems, whether they are sort of self-identifying that way or not.
We're going to have time for a couple of questions. If you want to raise your hand and pose a question to Brian, we'll have a microphone running out in a second. But one thing I was just out of kind of personal curiosity, Brian, as a Bob Dylan fan, I loved that you guys worked in a Dylan quote from one of his early records, "He not busy born is busy dying." Right. Any thoughts on why you or Charles plugged that one in? I was happy to see it.
Yeah, I will say I was the luckiest kid in the world. I grew up with parents. My dad was a huge Dylan fan, and my mom was one of those 15-year-old girls back in the 60s screaming for the Beatles. And so, you grow up with parents like that, things are going to be okay. So, truth be told, Charles was the one that really advocated to put the Dylan quote in. But when I saw that, I knew I got to do my mom justice. So if you look at the second section, the header to the second section, you'll see a Beatles reference as well. It's just covering bases.
What was the Beatles reference? I missed it.
There's if anybody's watching Get Back right now, which is an amazing documentary, I'm only about 2/3 of the way through, but wow. It's the long and winding road, right? It's the description for the path that our country has taken to try to find its North Star and its principles. But no, I mean, this notion of he not busy being born is busy dying is, a wonderful sort of encapsulation, I think, of the mentality that we've got to have both as an individual but also as a movement. That as good as we've done so far, and wow, have we had a hard struggle as a people who advocate for a free society, amidst this sort of top-down paradigm. As much as we've accomplished, we've got to always recognize we can do better, and we've got to be willing to sort of experiment with new ways to advance these ideas. And Dylan says it probably better, but Joseph Schumpeter said it a long time ago, right? This is this notion of creative destruction. If we're not constantly and continually trying to find new ways to do better and to find new ways to apply these principles to help people improve their lives, we're going to fail, right? We're going to find ourselves sort of no longer relevant.
Very good. Who's got a question for Brian? Can we get a microphone to Bob Enlow, please? Thanks, Alex. Sorry.
So I'm blown away by the work you guys have done on free speech. So I'd like to hear more about your thoughts on Irshad Manji and how important that is in today's dialogue.
So free speech. I mean, there are probably a handful of issues that I think about as, I hate to put it in the negative, game over issues. And free speech is one of them. I mean, if we lose the ability to express ourselves and if people feel cowed into sort of silence, to me it's game over. Right? I mean, there is no example of a society that has made progress where speech was suppressed. And once you start to suppress speech, power begets power, and it's a very quick road to the list of horribles that follow. And so this is an issue that I think is absolutely essential for our movement, for our society, for our country, and it's one that's at probably greater risk than any time, I think, at least in my lifetime. I've been a huge fan of the ACLU on free speech. They have publicly abdicated, which is a real problem. And so now there is the need, not just the opportunity, but the need for organizations to step up and really kind of answer the call to defend free speech, whether it's popular or not. Now, the good news, Robert, as you say, is that you've got a group of people who are sort of running into that gap, whether that's Jonathan Rauch and the wonderful work he's doing, Irshad Manji, somebody who comes more from the progressive left and sees the need to make sure that this is an issue that's at the forefront there. Groups like FIRE, Greg Lukianoff, warriors like Nadine Strassen. I mean, these are folks that are part of the broader liberal movement, and I think we need to do everything that we possibly can to lift up their voices and make sure that people understand that that's the right way forward.
We've got a question over here. If you can introduce yourself, please.
Hello, good morning. I'm Arif Nizami from Bangladesh. So my question is, the world is changing pretty much thanks to the digital technologies that we are having, and you just got a question about the freedom of speech. There was a time when previously we have been working with the government on those issues, but now the big tech companies are a major player of how the speech are going to be moderated online, and also everything is business and everything is on digital. So companies like Google, Facebook, they also regulate how the businesses are going to be operated. So what do you think the future is going to be working with the government and those big tech companies, and how non-profit organization can maintain a good relationship with the big tech, and how the things is going to be on the future? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really important question, and I wish I had a great answer for you. I think that this is one of those things that is going to be a defining issue for both our movement, but also the future of our societies, whether it's Bangladesh or the United States. I mean, it's a global issue. And so while as concerned as I think that we should be about the way that private companies are interacting with speech, and we need to advocate to them to do the right thing, I think the real threat comes from government control of speech. And so let's really make sure that those of us who understand how important liberty is and the ideas of a free society don't make the mistake of asking the government to be the arbiter of speech, even in the face of some of these challenging questions when it comes to the way that businesses are interacting with speech. I think ultimately, and this is not a satisfying answer, but I think it's the right one. Ultimately, the way to address what's happening right now in tech companies where we have concerns about speech is for another company to find a better product and deliver value to customers in a way that creates competitive pressures to get them to change. I understand that's not a satisfying answer, but it's a heck of a lot better than some of the other ones that are being offered from the top down and from government.
And I think this might relate also to one of the important topics in the book as well, which is about the dangers of corporate welfare, the need to be principled and push back on that. That's something that Charles Cook has done consistently throughout his career, but I think many of his critics never recognized it. Why does that remain part of the message in Believe in People?
Yeah, corporate welfare, cronyism, right? Governments picking winners and losers. To me, for those of us who have been working, in my case, an entire career to advance economic freedom, this has got to be top of our agenda, a way to figure out how to stop this stuff from happening. You think about the issues that we usually focus on, and rightly so, right? If we want to reform the tax code so that it is lower rates and a flatter code, we got to address corporate welfare, right? What made the 2017 reform a lowering of rates rather than a reform of the code? Corporate welfare, right? You couldn't get past the homeowners associations. You couldn't get past the retailers' special interests. Their spending through the tax code was just too ingrained in our system. So we weren't able to accomplish sort of economic freedom reforms that we know we need to for our country. You think about government spending. How do you reduce government spending? You better talk to the defense industry, right? This is the corporate welfare that's being doled out. I mean, why did discretionary spending increase by $300 billion in the first couple of years of the Trump administration, even when you had a Republican Congress? It was defense spending. It's what it was, right? And then there's this unholy sort of alliance where the Republicans get their defense spending, and they agree not to touch the Democrats' sort of advocacy for these bloated entitlement programs, corporate welfare. It's the same with regulation, right? One of the most pernicious forms of corporate welfare is regulation. So we, I think rightly, rail against the failed ideas that come from the left that advocate for regulation that doesn't actually improve society but is a huge drag on entrepreneurship. And we should keep doing that. But we also have to look the business community in the eye and say, look, you guys are the source of a whole lot of this stuff too, right? The regulation that big business especially is advocating for in order to restrict competition, to keep out new entrants in the market, is a huge source of the reason why we can't realize, a better and an economy that works for everybody. So, I always think back to Dodd-Frank, right? Dodd-Frank was a big issue that I worked on 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And after it passed, one of the largest increases in regulation in the financial sector ever. And, the CEO of Goldman Sachs puts out a quote and he says, look, we're all for it, right? We can handle this, we're big enough. But there's never going to be any more competition for us because what this does is it basically creates a moat around our business. And so this is all corporate welfare. And so if we really want to see the progress that we need to see in our country when it comes to economic freedom, this has got to be top of our list. It's a tough one, but there are solutions out there. So you got me kind of my soapbox. Don't get me started. This is critical.
Well, I'm going to give you one other soapbox. We've got limited time left. And I'm interested also in the theme of the book about not getting locked into partisanship and maybe some of the learning lessons that the Koch Foundation has had and where you've wound up, which I think is enabling conversations that were impossible in the recent past, but it's exciting to have them happen.
Yeah, so this one created a little bit of a storm, right? We had talked about a few years ago how we've always been for better policy, and policy remains one of our most important priorities, very engaged there, but that we had gone down the road of trying to achieve it through betting on one team, through partisan politics. And it turns out you can accomplish some things through that, but never really get the big things done for a lot of the reasons I just went through. And so we said, look, policy is important, partisanship's not the way to go. What we need to do is we need to find policy champions, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, doesn't matter, people that will advocate for policies that reflect the principles of a free society, policies that will help people improve their lives, and then form policy coalitions with them, bring the kind of support behind them that we need to see to pass good policies. This is how you get criminal justice reform done. It's also, by the way, how we as a movement and some of the groups that we support helped ensure the end of the longest war in our country's history in Afghanistan. It's the promise, I think, for education reform, as Robert talked about this morning. If we're going to get anything done on immigration, it's the only way forward. So this stuff works, but I know we're out of time, but we get a lot of credit for this insight, credit, blame, fury, whatever you want to call it. But it turns out there's nothing new under the sun, right? This is George Washington in his farewell address to the country. He says, look, there's a few things I've learned, and one of them is beware political parties. They'll say they're in it for the country. They're not in it for the country. They're in it for their own power. And I spent the early part of my career at the Mercatus Center about 15 doors down from Gordon Tullock. And if you ever really needed to learn a lesson, look at George Washington, look at Gordon Tullock and then look at the experience that we've had. It's just the way to get things done. Don't bet on any one team. Bet on the principles of a free society, and then support people that have the courage to advance them and make sure that they know that you're there for them.